Hello, everyone, for whom is connecting now. Just to say that we'll give just 1 more minute while participants join, and then we'll get started in the interest of time. Thank you. Okay, well, I think there are still a few participants connecting to the call, but in the interest of time, I think we can get started with the session. So officially welcome everyone to day 3 of GCA's Masterclass on climate resilient PPPs. Today we will be discussing 2 very important topics, which are innovative financing mechanisms for resilient infrastructure, as well as sustainable infrastructure, and how to integrate NBS into resilient infrastructure. Thank you for joining today, and I hope that you enjoyed the discussions. We encourage everyone to turn on their videos to have a little bit more interactivity between speakers and participants, and also to not be afraid of sharing any questions that you might have. So without further ado, I'd like to give the word to David, our moderator for this masterclass, and who will be introducing the speakers. David, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're located. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for tuning in again. We have 2 very interesting speakers who are going to talk about alternative financing, innovative financing, and nature-based solutions. The first speaker that we have is Virginie Marchal, and I'd like to welcome you, Virginie. She is a lead of sustainable infrastructure program in Central and Southeastern Asia, and has extensive expertise in the nexus between infrastructure, climate, and inclusive policies. She has also led a World Bank, a UN Environment, and OECD initiative financing climate futures and rethinking infrastructure, which laid out key recommendations for a low-emission resilient future. Virginie, we thank you from your participation at the OECD, and we hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today. And I hope my presentation will be useful for the participant of on this PPP class. So let me just share my screen with you for the presentation. Before the slide just shows on the screen, there's maybe one thing I'd like to say as an introduction. As David said, I'm from the OECD. At the OECD, we're not investing in projects. We're not investing in infrastructure. We actually don't have any money to lend, neither. So I'm giving this context because you may expect a very technical presentation with a list of tools and instruments, and this is not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to just give you the perspective that we're giving to governments, to policymakers, on what needs to happen in their policy frameworks, in their decision-making processes, to make sure we manage to mobilize investment in resilient infrastructure. So what I like you to take from this presentation today is really, how do you contribute to the ecosystem of actors, of institutions, of processes that are leading to a more resilient and more sustainable infrastructure asset, to a more sustainable provision of infrastructure services. So I'm going to start with the conclusion, just in case David wants to cut me at the end of the presentation if I'm too long. I want you to take away 4 key messages. The first one is that we're talking about financing, mobilizing finance for resilient infrastructure. Well, it cannot be taken in isolation with a much bigger challenge, which is financing the infrastructure gap and filling the infrastructure gap worldwide. So the challenges you see in resilient infrastructure are actually adding to challenges that are already existing for traditional infrastructure. The second point I'd like to raise, and it was a point made by Stefan Algat in an introductory session, it's good to break silos. So you see probably resilience from the angle of climate adaptation and climate change, and we're part of a specific community on this topic. But actually resilience is mainly about economic and development. And it's quite important because the key actors in making resilient infrastructure happen are from the finance and economy sphere, and not necessarily from different parts of the government that would deal with climate change. And this is a key thing to realize when we're thinking about mobilizing finance for resilient infrastructure. Third message, and again, Stefan Algat mentioned it, super important to invest in the asset and in the infrastructure. But what is even more important and more impactful in many developed and developing countries is to invest in the proper governance and policy framework that is providing the environment for the risk-return profile of those infrastructure projects. So it's basically all the incentives that are provided by the different policies to have those projects. So it's really beyond the instruments. And finally, yes, we need to talk about financial instruments, and particularly to mobilize private sector finance. The public sector will not be able to deal with the infrastructure gap, and is sometimes not the best person to invest as well in those types of assets. But here what we need is to integrate really this climate risk into the market. And this is thanks to government's approaches and government's interventions through mandatory disclosure and transparency around climate risk. And the second thing, and this is where actually multilateral development organization, investment banks, and national development banks have a key role to play, is to think about special financing instruments to bridge the remaining failures in the market. But this is really a tool at the very end of the spectrum to really fill the remaining gaps rather than the end game and an objective per se. So this is basically the kind of conclusions of my presentation, and I'm going to just dive a bit more on each of those points in the coming presentation. So the infrastructure challenge, you're probably all aware of that, but we're in the middle of a triple crisis. The first crisis is the infrastructure investment gap. We estimate that between 6 and 7 trillion of infrastructure $trillion of infrastructure are needed in the next 30 years to meet development goals. And if you had the climate challenge, well, it could amount to 7 trillion, but depending on the modeling, the number is highly uncertain. But what is sure is that it's a scale of magnitude. And when we look at the current investment today, we are actually around 3 to 4 trillion. So we need a massive scale up in investment in infrastructure. The second big challenge is the post-COVID economic crisis. Global GDP retracted last year of around 4%. So we see rebound this year. But what we see is that this crisis has left a lot of governments without any fiscal space, or with a very limited fiscal space. So public intervention and public finance is even going to be more scarce than it used to be. And the third point on the impact of this COVID crisis is that the issue is that the people that were most impacted are actually the poorest and the SMEs. And those are people that are extremely relying on global infrastructure services to reintegrate the economy moving forward. The third crisis is the climate and biodiversity emergency. So why infrastructure is at the center of that? Because on the one hand, you have 60% of emissions that are embedded in our current infrastructure systems. And on the other end, the infrastructure we build today are here to be there like for decades, and they'll determine our resilience to future climate change. What does it mean? It means that we cannot take an incremental approach when we think about financing resilient infrastructure. We cannot take an asset by asset perspective saying, what do I need to do to make this asset resilient? What we need is to rethink about a system of infrastructure that will still provide the same service, meaning we need transportation systems, we need energy, we need food, but thinking differently in how we provide the system. And we could reduce the demand of the system, but we could also think about other ways to provide those infrastructure services. And it's absolutely essential to consider the resilience challenge in this context. Having said that, I'm not saying that the climate mitigation should take over the resilience aspect. Resilience is absolutely key in infrastructure. Why? Because it has huge economic consequences not to have any resilient systems. It has some it creates some economic damages. It threatens the functioning of nature, the degradation of soil. It creates as well it has an impact on people with a number of deaths. So the kind of direct consequences of any climate hazard on an infrastructure are significant. What is important as well are the indirect consequences, because the infrastructure works in a system, and actually one asset that is impacted can create rebound effect on a systemic shock in the environment. And this is what we can see in many of the disasters that have been seen in the past. So our economies are so interconnected between the systems so that the shock propagates across other systems. So in a sense, investing in resilient infrastructure matters because it can improve the reliability of infrastructure service provision. It can increase the asset life of infrastructure, avoiding early retirement of some assets. It can increase the efficiency of the service provision. It can protect asset returns, which is absolutely essential if you take the perspective of an investor, and reduce the risk of stranded assets. Stranded assets are assets that we need to retire before the end of their economic life because they're no longer fit for purpose in the economies or they no longer have a proper return on investment. And it brings a lot of co-benefits on nature protection and the preservation of ecosystems and sometimes on climate mitigation. So the benefits are absolutely clear, but what we see is that still the investment is still lagging and struggling to happen within governments. We're really struggling to see mainstreaming of resilience concepts in infrastructure plans and in infrastructure projects. Why is that? Why don't we have more investors jumping in those projects? Well, first, there are the barriers that are linked to just traditional infrastructure projects. Those are long-term horizons. They are quite complex projects. We're missing a lot of financial instruments to attract institutional investors, for instance, in infrastructure. They dedicate less than 1% of their portfolio to infrastructure. So there are those kind of traditional barriers, but the thing that bringing in resilience is bringing additional barriers, such as, again, the challenge of time horizons, because the benefits of overinvestment today, well, the cost is there today, overinvestment, but the benefits are really in the longer term. And sometimes it's avoided costs, so it's very hard to monetize. The second barrier is the uncertainty around the future. So each infrastructure project needs to be screened against a range of scenarios and be future-proofed against those scenarios. A third challenge is the challenge of information and capacity. Climate modelization is complex, comes with a lot of uncertainties, and there is really a need to build capacity for practitioners around those issues. There are some policy misalignments. There are some signals in the policy framework that are acting against mainstreaming adaptation at the core of infrastructure projects. Distorted incentives, the fact, for instance, that financiers are remunerated on a very short-term basis in terms of the returns on investment of their project, which is creating a disincentive to think about the longer term and of the resilience. And then some externalities, we're really struggling to incorporate the benefits or the value of investing in resilience in the economic calculation of the project and the infrastructure assets. So This is a bit dark and gloom. Actually, I'm going to pass those slides. I can go back to it. Now, the key message on the slides I passed is that there's a momentum of action around climate, around adaptation, but things actually are not happening. If we look at the COVID, post-COVID recovery plans, we realize that adaptation and resilience is actually a very minimum part of the 20% of investment that are going to environment goal. It's around 2 or 3%. So it's really not mainstream for the time being. So how can we make it mainstream and how can we really create the transformation that is needed in our systems? So this slide is a bit shiny with colors, but it's actually, it's from the conclusion of the report we published a few years ago with the World Bank and the UNEP on really how to move from those incremental progress on climate to the real transformation that is needed. And the key conclusion from the report was that we actually need to target policies that are outside of the realm of climate policies, and we need to address the misalignments, the counter incentives that are happening in the system. And the 6 transformative areas and actions that we identified were around planning, innovation, the role of budget and the role of public finance, the financial system, and we need to reset the incentives in the financial system, development finance, institutions that have a tremendous role to play, but sometimes don't have the right mandates actually to really act seriously on those issues. And last but not least, on the need to include local governments, it's often overlooked, but they are the first investors in infrastructure. More than 70% of infrastructure investment comes from decisions from local governments, and they need to be really involved in the loop. So now I'm going to dive a bit in each of the recommendations on specific aspects of resilience. The first one on which I want to insist on, just wait a minute. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat box, sorry, it didn't pop up, so I still have a bit of time. So the first one is about the planning. Why it's important to plan and to have long-term planning, because it's to avoid emission locking, to integrate long-term resilience in the system, and to prevent stranded assets. It seems like an obvious thing to do. You need long-term plans if you want to be able to make good decisions in the present. But actually, it's easy to say, and it's much harder to put to implement. So the first thing to do, sorry. No, okay, it's working now. So the first thing to do in those plans is to create those low emission, resilient, long-term development strategies. It's not so much the strategy that is important. What is important is the process through which the strategy is done. It's putting around the table all the stakeholders that need to be involved in long-term infrastructure planning and general economic planning. It's ministries of economies, of finance, transport, energy, all those people that really need to share their own vision and have a common understanding of the uncertainties and the vision that is moving forward. An important thing in those long-term strategy as well is to involve the private sector, because the private sector can bring the view of the constraints and the necessities that they will have to deliver a long-term vision. In order to inform well a long-term strategy, you need climate capacity, you need data. Governments need to be able to see maps of what are the ecosystems, what are the services, what are the areas at risk, so that they can develop really maps of how to site infrastructure projects and what are the trade-offs they're making when they're making decisions on siting one project in one area or another. But having long-term plans is fine, but it's not enough. You need to have an associate pipeline of bankable projects. And this is often what is missing, this link between the long-term plan and the decision today on the pipeline of infrastructure. It's not that easy to make sure projects are aligned with long-term plans. It requires, again, whole of governance approaches and multi-stakeholder consultation, but there are some very interesting tools that are being developed on how to monetize non-financial aspects of projects and be able to prioritize projects according to benefits that go just beyond financial returns, but also resilience, benefits on the climate mitigation agenda. I'm thinking about Savvy, a tool developed by IISD, and I know it was part of your handbook. I think there's a description of the tool, but there are plenty others, and there are innovative ways to really make sure projects are aligned with long-term goals, and there's a pipeline of projects existing. Without a pipeline of projects, private investors will not come in because they need certainty, and they need to know they're investing in a project that has a certain standard as well, or that is vetted against a long-term sustainable benefit. Second point is, well, make resilience the norm, not the exception. It's a bit of, trying to be a sexy title, but it doesn't mean much. But basically here, what we are saying is that resilience is not only about upgrading an asset. Resilience is also about thinking, this is what I said up front, thinking about how I provide an infrastructure service. So reshaping demand to reduce demand and reduce the vulnerability of assets, or the way we provide the service, is important. Just to give you a concrete example, net metering that you put on households so that people can control how much energy they're using and maybe reducing their consumption of energy is a way to reduce demand in energy and monitor this demand. Or the tools used for transport systems. In Seoul, they have those tools that are really developed where people can really make their decisions in real time on how to best use the transport system so that they don't create a congestion or that they don't have any interruption. So this is absolutely essential. And the second way to make resilience the norm is to be able sometimes to not to invest. Really, the best infrastructure is the one that is not built. And this is all the theme really to increase the use of nature-based solution. Well, I know the next presentation is about those issues, so I won't go further on that.
Virginie, you have 5 minutes left.
I have 5 minutes. Thank you. Last but not least, actually on the planning, it's good to have a plan, but in the context of resilience, it's even more important to review the plan, to have mechanisms in place that are able to push the stakeholders to change maybe their priorities according to the development in science of the knowledge, and this is quite important. And here there are some techniques as well to help review those plans. One of those techniques is foresight scenarios. So I like this slide because it looks like totally inapplicable and impractical, but basically it's about doing some thinking about plausible futures and doing backcasting scenarios, checking if the decisions made today are future-proofed. Again, those kind of plausible futures that would go in the future. Second point I want to make, and it's absolutely essential, so I really want to emphasize that, is the role of public procurement. I mean, you have between 10 and 25% of countries' GDP that is invested through public procurement, which means that governments are significant market setters. They have the power to create markets, to create a demand for resilience, and it's absolutely essential that in their process for public procurement, they monetize the benefits of resilience, and they don't make resilient projects uncompetitive because they're a bit more expensive or maybe longer to build as part of their process. So integrating the benefits of resilience in project evaluation. Another way to do that is also for policymakers to impose standards and regulation on minimum resilience to bring in the system, and strengthening the requirement on strategic environmental assessment or environmental impact assessments. And a third thing is also to try to favor innovation. Often governments tend to commission a road rather than commissioning a service that will provide transport for those people in this neighborhood. And it's actually being prescriptive about the technology you're using or other type of infrastructure is kind of preventing any innovation in the system. Third, it's about screening projects through screening infrastructure progress through climate-related risks. This mainly applies to MDBs and NNDBs. Developing risk screening tools to prioritize projects that have at their core resilience is essential. Actually, it's happening. A lot of MDBs are developing tools. I think you saw the World Bank tool, that the tool that the World Bank is using to integrate those risks. So this is very positive and encouraging. There are just a few things to keep in mind when using those tools. First, the source of data, to make sure that it's consistent and credible. It's easy to say, it's super hard to implement. I'm very conscious of that. The second is to make sure that you create links between the developers and the users of your screening system to make sure it's fit for purpose. But more importantly, is that you use this tool at an appropriate time in the lending process. Because if you use the tools at a stage where it's too late to change the key specification of the project, and I mean, it's nice to know that it's actually inappropriate, but you can't really influence the infrastructure. So, and this is where it links to the need to invest and put a lot of emphasis on the preparation phase of the projects and invest a bit in those risk screening to make sure that you design the project in an appropriate way.
2 minutes left.
Yeah. Fourth, and this is where I'm diving a bit more in the subject of finance and mobilizing finance. Here, what do you need to do really to leverage those private investments? The first thing is to have standards and definitions, taxonomies. Investors need to have kind of a reference to know that the project they're investing in is resilient or not resilient. So creating those taxonomies is absolutely essential. Second is disclosure, moving investors towards mandatory disclosure so that this climate risk is integrated in the market is also something fundamental. And the third thing is on clarifying legal mandates for the investors. It's for instance, looking at MDBs and saying, well, the clear mandate of the MDB should be to create resilience or to act for climate, rather than using indicators for MDB practitioners that are how much lending did you do? And this is your kind of a performance criteria. But this is a longer term thing to do and not an easy fix, but this is about correcting the incentives. In terms of the MDBs and the different instruments that are available to fill the remaining gaps in the risk return profile of projects, I want to insist on two. The first one is on the risk preparation, the project development facilities and the technical assistance up front, because this is the key. What will be done up front will save a lot of time and money in the future, and MDBs have a key role to play on that. And the second is the use of blended finance instruments, guarantees and debt mechanisms that can help better balance the risk return profile of the projects and improve the bankability. Okay, I think I'll skip the local government fund because maybe it's a bit further to of your topic, but actually I would be really interested if you have some questions on that, or if you want to share your experience on how it's been easy or difficult to deal with local stakeholders, or if you have to deal with them at all moving forward. So all those recommendations are great. This is what we do at the OECD. We give recommendations, but the challenge often is in implementation. I'm very aware of that. This is why actually I just wanted to flag a project that we're starting with Central Asia and Southeast Asia, where it's about trying to build capacity within those countries on those different aspects of the infrastructure planning cycle. It's for resilient and for low carbon. One of the key focuses is the net zero transition, but it's really going to governments and identifying who are the practitioners, what do they need to do, and what sort of training programs would be useful for them across the infrastructure cycles to create communities of infrastructure practitioners that would be proficient in those things. Last thing, all of the points I raised can have a transcription in terms of technical tools and instruments. I share my presentation. There are a few that are coming from the OECD, but I know there are others as well. But we have a handbook for quality infrastructure investment. We have principles for sustainable infrastructure that has been developed with the G20. We have principles for good governance on infrastructure that are coming as well for the G20 from our governance. So I just want to say that there are a lot of tools that are existing. And if you need maybe help to navigate this very abundant information actually on those issues, I'm happy to help and or to receive your help to see what is more useful for you. Okay, I'm going to stop here and I'm happy to take some.
Thank you, Virginie. We have some questions that have been popping up on the screen. One question that I just wanted to ask, you said, testing numerous, scenarios, future-proofing. And I was just wondering, how do you test technological obsolescence, for example? Because something that's great now in 5 years or 10 years' time might not, be worth 5 cents at that time, because we're in such a dramatic changing world. Is there concern about that? People are proposing tremendous innovations, but how do we test them?
It's an absolutely, no, it's a great question. And I don't have a simple answer to that. The only thing, at the OECD, we're trying to be technology agnostic. So making sure that any recommendations, we're trying to create policy frameworks where technologies can emerge, but not to be prescriptive about one type of technology or another. Having said that, it was our first, that was the recommendation like 15 years ago, but given the urgency of climate action, there is a rationale to make some bets on some technologies, because you don't have time to see which one is the most appropriate and to let just the market develop as it is in other sectors, such as in the digital economy. So here the importance is for governments to develop clear roadmaps and being aware of the assumptions they are making on the technology, and maybe create those kind of checking mechanisms as time goes by. Does the technology, does it deliver on the promises? I'm year 1 or year 2 after the implementation. The cost, is it really reduced to what I thought it would be reduced? My infrastructure base, is it following? Is there a kind of competitive technology that could be a real outlier and destroy the role for the initial technology? So I think it's up to policymakers to be brave sometimes and to make bets and take risks, but being aware of the bets they're making and being able to change routes when it's necessary, when recognize their mistakes, which is not always easy.
Thank you very much. Jan van Soonhoven, you had a question about savings in the future, money invested now for the future. Would you like to pose your question? And please put on your screen and make sure you're not on mute. Thank you.
I have my screen on, David. Hi. Yeah, thank you very much, and a very interesting topic. One of the, I call that the repeating one-liners I see in a lot of documents is that $1 invested saves $4 in the future. I even heard $10 in the future. I think, I know Dutch people can sometimes be blunt, so that's not my intention. But if that was true, and that savings were true, we didn't have this course. So I think the challenge is if you talk about how far in the future, is that for the next 50 years or the next 10 years? The second question is, who will benefit? Because if the whole population benefits from a project, there is a misalignment between those who benefit and those who pay. And I think the savings will be different in any country. So I think to promote PPPs and climate adaptation, this truly one-liner, because I think it's true, needs deepening to really have an impact on future infrastructure or current infrastructure projects we do. And I'm not asking you to come up with thousands of proofs, but could you somehow elaborate on for whose those savings are, how far you look in the future, and how we could benefit from it somehow?
Thank you. Thanks for your question. So the quote on $1 to $4 is actually coming from a World Bank calculation and estimates, and it's part of the report Stefan Algat presented at the beginning of the seminar. I'm not challenging it, and I don't think the 1 to 4, 1 to 10 matters. I think what it's important is to show that we're talking about investment and not just about cost. And this is the kind of difference I think we want to bring in the mind of investors and of policymakers. Where I think you have a very good point is that the $4 are not going in the same pocket than the one who invested the dollar. And this is a challenge. Maybe he's not going to receive anything in his pocket, the investors, because it's a public good. It's general good. So this is where, in adaptation particularly, governments and public money has a key role to play. You cannot just think the private sector is going to go by altruism or on his own, because when you look at the pure risk return profile of the investment, the math doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So this is why you need those public interventions. This is why through public procurement you can have minimum standards that are obliging the investors to do the terms of reference of their projects with higher standards, and so that, but the benefits will be captured by the community. They're not captured by the investors most of the time.
Thank you for that very honest answer, and I think it's a really interesting perspective. There are a few questions that have popped up that we haven't had a chance to answer. We'll give the opportunity at the end of this session, but it is time to hand over to the next presenters. And thank you, Virginie, very much. And I really found your slides most informative. We're now going to move to the next topic, and we will have the participation of Gianleo Frisari and Ancor Suarez from the Inter-American Development Bank. Gianleo is a climate change economist and works on financial instruments, sustainable and resilient PPPs. Ancor is a PPP specialist that is a leading IDB PPP advisory, well, it's been leading IDB advisory work with 26 governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm really interested to see, you know, in the aspect of, with your PPP backgrounds and nature-based solutions, what you have to say. It's going to be interesting. Both of you will be tag teaming with one another, and I'm handing the floor over to you, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Many thanks for the presentation, David, and thanks so much to the Global Center on Adaptation for the invitation. It's a pleasure for us to be here and share some ideas on PPPs and sustainable infrastructure. At the PPP unit at the Inter-American Development Bank, we work to strengthen the environment and project preparation in Latin American and the Caribbean countries. And before addressing sustainable infrastructure, MBS, PPPs in the region, please let me some time to give you a little bit of background on the challenges of the region, and particularly that some countries face to develop the so much needed infrastructure. So please, if you can move to the next slide. I would like to start with a couple of facts. I would say that if you look at the fact one, there's no way we can start a presentation on infrastructure, economic growth, and equity without addressing the COVID-19 impact in the region and its implications for infrastructure development. Our studies show, as you can see in the graph, how the region can face a GDP decline between 6 to 14% in the next 3 years, considering different scenarios. And this estimated impact on the deficit and the level of public debt of the countries of the region is highly significant. I would say like average public debt has grown from 40% to 62%, which in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean is really high, pointing to a clear deterioration of the fiscal accounts. So it's today, I would say, even more critical than ever to practice a responsible fiscal behavior in order to get out of the crisis as best and quick as possible. But if you see the fact too, what we know in the region is that in times of crisis, the previous patterns show how the economies in LAC may be on the way to a sharp reduction in capital spending, and that particularly affects to infrastructure investment. In the region, capital expenditure are procyclical and suffer larger cuts when the economies experience difficult times. So one example of this was in the financial and fiscal crisis that the region went through in the 80s, where much of the country's fiscal relief came from a drastic reduction on investment in infrastructure. So it's just to sum up on that, the history of the region proves that a strong contraction in public investment in infrastructure should be expected. But at the same time, what we also know on the fact 3 is that it's a challenge to not to spend resources for infrastructure development given this scenario, but the region cannot afford not to invest in infrastructure. What you see in there, it's some of our results for some studies where we estimate the cost of not investing enough to increase capital stocks and to maintain the existing infrastructure. And the cost of not doing so goes up to 1% of GDP per year. And if this policy persists, we would say like in 10 years, we would lose around 15% of regional GDP for not investing in maintenance and adding capital stock to the region. So the scenario is that there's not that much resources to invest in infrastructure. We know that the situation is going to get worse because of the experience that we know from previous crises, and we know that we cannot afford not to invest in infrastructure because the consequences are going to be much more needs in the near future. And at the same time, we also know that the situation has a huge deficit in infrastructure from a quantitative, qualitative, and efficiency perspective. What you see on the fact 4, it's the situation or the relative or a comparison of the infrastructure quality in Latin America and the Caribbean country vis-a-vis to other regions worldwide. And we see that in relative terms, the region is losing competitiveness. So if we can move to the next slide, please. This, as I'm saying, this insufficient and low quality infrastructure is the result somehow of not enough investment. The region invests around 3% of GDP to traditional infrastructure. There's a lot of studies discussing about the so-called gap, as Virginie was mentioning. Some say that we need to invest 3, 4, or 5 points more. But it's not only that we are not investing enough, it's that we are not investing good enough. If we take a look to the efficiency levels of the investment in the region, we see, and that's what you find on the fact 7, that almost 1 out of $2 that are spent in infrastructure are wasted. And that means that, and if you move to the fact 8, that means that there's a lot of reasons why the money that it's spent in infrastructure is not achieving what it's supposed to achieve. And that goes to cost overruns, time delays. Let's say, for example, that the region has cost overruns that gets almost the double to the world average. The world average is close to 28%. Latin American and Caribbean countries face cost overruns close to 50%. And this is just the side of cost overruns. If you take a look, for example, to time delays, is probably one of the main regions in the world when it comes to all the time that it takes to get all the permits and administrative procedures to procure infrastructure. And yet, the region is the main region in the world when it comes, the main developing region in the world when it comes to the attraction of private participation. So basically, closing this quantitative and qualitative and efficiency gap in infrastructure requires not only developing more and better roads, solar farms, water treatment plants, hospitals, but also a transformation on how these assets are planned, developed, operated, while considering the different dimensions of sustainability, as we're going to mention, because this is not just about social and environmental aspects, but also the institutional sustainability, the economic and financial sustainability, and much more important these days, the fiscal sustainability. And why we are putting that much attention to the efficiency levels that the projects are developed and prepared, and the assets are constructed and the services are provided, because it's critical to remember that the infrastructure investment policies and decisions made now will determine whether we can limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or not. And given not only what Virginie was mentioning about these 60% of emissions that are embedded to our infrastructure, but also because 70% of the forecast growth in emissions in developing countries will come from infrastructure that is yet to be built. So this is an ample room to work for working when it comes to properly prepare the projects that are gonna design and establish the infrastructure of the future. So sustainable PPP project preparation is the key. If we can move to the next slide, which is basically a summary of what we already mentioned. Of course, we have a couple of hyperlinks and so on. I guess if the organization wants to share the slides, we are so happy doing so. So in a way, it's essential to enhance the participation of the private sector to close the sustainability infrastructure gap. And for this, the well-prepared and structured public-private partnerships are an extraordinary tool. They also bring the potential to generate great benefits and savings through improvements in efficiency in public spending. And I would like to take one of the questions that we heard from the previous session. I think was Giovani, and take the opportunity to answer a little bit here. What we know from our experience is that through the proper planning, the PPP can guarantee the better development, the operation, the maintenance of infrastructure assets and services in the time of crisis, as well as preserve the adequate investment levels during the fiscally constrained periods, including the one that we are facing these days. And I'm putting particularly attention to the dimensions of sustainability. So having these numbers in mind, the key question for us in here is that how we get to properly prepare projects and properly prepare those projects from an overall sustainability perspective in mind. If we can move to the next slide, it's important to say, and I think it was also mentioned in the presentation by Virginie, that the infrastructure project preparation costs are important one, a remarkable one. We would say that between 5 to 10% in developing countries of the capex, or between 3 to 5% in developed ones. But we need to see this pre-investment, we say, as a way to avoid further cost. If we need to understand what are the benefits of developing the infrastructure in a sustainable way and attending to every single aspect of the sustainability dimensions, by these investments, by understanding that we are going to incur in higher cost in order to be sure that the project as sustainable as they should be, what we are going to get is the savings of those of that high levels of high inefficiency levels of public spending in infrastructure. For example, if you take a look to the graph below and to the table below, you see how in some of our studies that we're happy to share, the land or the property related conflicts, the environmental conflicts, the social consultations with communities involved in project preparation, all those can get up to 80% of cost overruns. This is a lot of money that could be saved if we invest enough in the proper sustainable preparation at the very beginning. So the cost benefit analysis of investing in sustainable infrastructure and investing in proper project preparation of sustainable infrastructure, it's quite key. And what you see in the graph is that project preparation in the region still a bottleneck for the development of infrastructure in the region. We implement together with the Economist Intelligence Unit a tool called InfraScope, where we see how Latin America and the Caribbean lags behind the countries in Asia or Middle East and North Africa when it comes to their abilities to properly prepare projects. And this is basically where we work. And this also has this is quite perceivable at the investor side. The graph that you see on your right shows the different barriers to investment in sustainable infrastructure in Latin American and the Caribbean countries. And what the most investors point out is the need to develop, and also aligned with the Virginie presentation, the need to develop well-prepared pipeline of projects having these sustainable dimensions in mind, and also to work on to get the appropriate regulatory and institutional frameworks for PPPs. So if we can move to the next slide. And this is why at the PPP unit, we pay particularly attention to reflect the IDB group attributes and framework for sustainable infrastructure into our upstream by supporting regulatory and institutional PPP frameworks, but also on planning and project prioritization, but also on downstream preparing sustainable and efficient PPPs, and particularly and related to what we are doing today to provide some knowledge support and capacity building. And we do so from the business development, improving the project selection and optimizing the infrastructure portfolios, but also streamlining the infrastructure delivery over the different phases of project preparation. So I would like to reinforce the message that investing in properly preparing the sustainable infrastructure projects is then the best way to reduce uncertainty and to eliminate these inefficiencies and minimize the contingent liabilities in the development of public infrastructure, as the fiscal dimension is a key area of the sustainability concept. I now leave the floor to my colleagues, Gianleo Frisari, to talk about some specific tools we have designed to improve the sustainability of PPPs.
Thank you, Ancor, and well, very nice to meet you all. Yeah, the idea of my intervention is really to ground the presentation by Ancor in two big examples of tools that we offer. One on structuring and the other on financing. We have enlarged the scope from MBS to also include resiliency, so it's consistent with what Virginie presented just before. Next slide, please. The first tool, yes, is to support the integration of resiliency in the preparation and structuring of PPP projects. It's a publication we did last year, actually, with a great collaboration of the Development Bank of Jamaica, whose Ricardo Muro is actually part of the audience today. So he's piloting this tool. If there are questions about the use, I think he can take the microphone. But the tool is aimed at supporting the transaction, the cycle from the identification to contract management, and the integration of resiliency in this process, going from really when projects are early identified and the first risk assessed to favor basically the selection and the prioritization of projects more with a better risk profile and tune with resiliency. Evaluation of resiliency when we build the business case for a project, we analyze the value for money. Then the inclusion of resiliency in the transactions in documents, so in the tender process, the incentivizing of resilient solutions from the bidders, I think the topic that Virginie mentioned, as well as the enabling whoever evaluates the bids to properly award resiliency within the other criteria like cost, time, and experience. And finally, how to include resiliency when managing contracts, when managing payments, so how to pay for resilience performance, how to penalize for performance that doesn't see resilience and account for resilience. Next slide, the toolbox is made of very different and specific tools for each phase. And these are decision support tools, including different arrays of decision trees, example of the transactions, guided language to include in the documents. I've put here, in the interest of time, a couple. Next one. In the case of the second phase, how to evaluate resiliency when building the business case. One problem is how to evaluate climate risk considering the uncertainty, and what tools PPP owners, PPP units have. And here is how to use, considering capacities and data, when to use climate scenarios, when to use sensitivity analysis or probabilistic analysis, depending on the data that the PPP unit has and the expertise as well in the unit itself. And the tool explains the pros and cons of each approach, and when each approach is suitable and what like expectation in terms of the impact on cost-benefit analysis, value for money, each approach can have. Next one, a different tool for the phase of transaction is how to evaluate climate events extreme, weather events related to climate in future, especially considering whether all climate events should be considered force majeure, as is the norm now, or if we can define and refine the definition of force majeure in accounting for the recurrence of climate events. The language here, the suggestion is to start differentiating events that cannot be foreseen, cannot be managed, low occurring, very high impact events, like floods in 100 years, that could remain, should remain force majeure, and start trying to exclude force majeure events that are instead beginning to be recurring, where there is insurance available, where there are private sector tools available that might be more expensive, but might actually yield better returns in terms of force majeure management. And there are examples already in the earthquake industry from Chile, from Japan, the toolbox accounts for, and we're trying to design now, especially with Jamaica, some parallel for the case of climate. Next. This was about structuring. This again, this is a tool that is still in development, and this will be in continuous development to support the structuring. How we can support the financing, and in this case, is a new publication with WRI that will be published shortly, related to putting together a set of examples and instruments, financing instruments that can be successfully used for MBS financing, try to understand their challenges and their applicability. What we mean here with nature-based solutions, MBS, are strategic restoration, protection, or management of ecosystem with intentional societal challenges. Why we think they are important is because evidence shows that the combination of this green over gray infrastructure can be actually more cost-effective and sustainable than the traditional green infrastructure alone. And many times this increased sustainability is actually from resiliency, from better climate risk management. However, MBS projects have a typical challenge with it's very similar to the challenges that Virginie sketched for resilient project in terms of like their profile, their bankability, and their scalability over very specific local applications. These are the key steps that this paper identifies when financing MBS. First of all, incorporate MBS in planning and policies, very similar to resiliency. It's important to get the MBS profile in the design of the projects and to design the incentives, designing the policies, in order to identify very early on the project more suitable for MBS. Integrate MBS into the familiar infrastructure models. We have an example about integrating MBS in fixed income bonds to improve their scalability, because as these are traditional instruments where investors are very used to buy and sell, increase the steady and consistency of cash flows, especially to improve credit worthiness. Here we have a role to play as multilaterals. I think incentives from policy making are actually the biggest factor. Increase the monetization opportunities for MBS, especially dedicating streams. We'll see shortly an example about this. And then finally demonstrate performance metric, create a database to support pricing of the benefits for MBS and the risk, as this is key to develop an insurance, to develop financial instruments on top of that award better risk management through MBS. The paper sketches 6 different type of instruments that have been used for MBS financing. Next. The first one is, as mentioned, using green bonds. Why this? And we have the example of the Netherlands, very large transaction that included the green infrastructure to prevent flooding and against the sea level rise. But also at a smaller scale, we have the example of the Unibond here in the US, the Arkansas Border Green Bond, that uses MBS green approaches for watershed protection. Why the bonds are in this case? Because established taxonomies that investors are very, very familiar now already include MBS, already have sections for MBS, especially the water standard already includes green infrastructure. Investors are very familiar with this tool. Many times there are already large investors, institutional investors who have been buying green bonds for a few years, and the bonds themselves are able to reach scale, like in the case of the Dutch, because the issuance program can be replicated and redone. The challenges still outstanding for green bonds issuance is that the process can be costly. Here we have to consider that issuing capital markets is already financially onerous sometimes, plus the making it green, verifying the greenness can add transaction costs. And bonds are not always a good fit for any issuers. We, especially as local governments credit worthiness, access to capital markets, even debt sustainability are not always easy to manage for these issuers, and green bonds being a bond becomes a good fit as a tool. Next,
you have left.
Okay, I have 2 slides left. Next, instruments, like the case of the forest resilience bonds in California, where grants from the government, from the state, and taxpayer money through repayments have been used to stabilize the risk profile of this restoration of the forest and protection against wildfires. Important because risk mitigation can change and can improve the bankability of the project. Unfortunately, the challenges are very limited to the availability of concessional capital. The ability, as we've seen in this case, the grant money is very specific to the state and is not easily replicable. The third instrument is using policy frameworks. In this example is from Mexico City, is a land-based financing mechanism related to selling rights in exchange of green-gray solutions for the verification of the neighborhood. In this case, it's important because it's a way to monetize MBS, to monetize the ecosystem service, and again the risk-return ratio because it secures the funding stream. The ability of this money, the local characteristic of the policymakers, and also of the challenges of implementing a policy to support this system. Last slide, please. The final two instruments are using insurance. There is an example in the paper from Quintana Roo, the use of parametric insurance to restore coral reef after storms. It's a very low transaction cost approach because you use insurance over wind speeds to finance the rehabilitation of damaged corals. However, it takes a lot of data analysis to understand at which wind thresholds corresponds to certain type of damages to the coral. So it took several years of analysis. And in this case, although there is an improvement of the risk-return ratio because the losses are protected by the insurance, the transaction costs to implement these schemes are quite significant. The last scheme that we've seen is the endowment model that basically diversifying using loan capital. We have the example of the fund in Quito in Ecuador, where money from the utility, a portion of the money from the utility and from the local government and from the user of the watershed has been stored for years into an endowment fund that does very long-term investments, is not limited by immediate return considerations. It can actually be that kind of like patient capital aligned with the need of the very long, let's say, typically very long payoff systems of MBS. Here again, the challenge here is to make sure these instruments are available, making sure that the money that utilities users are willing to store this capital away and make it available for long-term investments. David, this was the last slide from my side.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing those tools. That's incredibly important for people who are looking for ways to solve this and to also implement NBS. I have a question. There's two questions quickly that I'm going to ask. I'm not sure how we'll decide who answers the question, but there's a question from Chabizo Ekweakur. Could you please put on your screen and make sure you ask the question? I see your hand up, but I don't see your face. So if you could please activate your video screen as well, please.
Thank you, David, and thanks, gentlemen, for the presentation, and Virginie too, thank you very much. I was just trying to find out, I mean, given the fact that you indicate clearly that the public funds are diminishing, and obviously with the economic realities at the moment, are there ways in which perhaps some support or encouragement could be provided for project preparatory financing? Because the truth is that issues of climate resilience are best taken up at that early preparatory design stage. They're best mainstreamed at that point. And one of the major reasons some governments or locations are not doing that at that point is both the perception and the reality that it involves a little more expenditure at that time. So how have you managed to deal with that, if you have? Thank you.
Many thanks for the question, Gianleo. If you want, I can go with that one.
Yes, please.
I think it's a great question and a key question, and probably one of the reasons why we work with countries and with governments in order to improve and to finance project preparation. I would say, like, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the need to extrapolate best practices from one countries to another, and to play our role as multilateral development institutions. And we do we do finance the projects and the project preparation and some of them. This is the reason why there's, I would say, many initiatives worldwide regarding to the development of project preparation facilities. We, for example, at the IDB with the PPP unit, we participate and we participate in the pre-feasibility, feasibility, and the structuring of certain projects in order to do that kind of pre-investment. we do that in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. But for example, we are for Latin American countries, the technical partner of the Global Infrastructure Facility, which is led by some governments worldwide and the World Bank, in order to have the resources to properly prepare projects following the standards of the international community. And when it comes to PPPs, of the certification guide that we all the multilaterals have developed together in order to standardize these best practices. So I would say, like, in order to try to answer that equation, because I perfectly understand it's kind of part of our presentation, that we need to find a hard equilibrium, right? Because we know that we need to invest in this pre-investment in order to have future savings, in order to avoid much much more cost in the future. But at the same time, we need to find those resources. So I would say that this is why we have developed these project preparation facilities. We do it, for example, in our experience, we fund specific projects in economic and social sectors together with governments in Latin American and the Caribbean countries. But in some other cases, we are partnered with these other facilities like global infrastructure facilities to work together in some projects, and you can find similar experiences that apply to Europe, Africa, and to many regions worldwide, together with the multilateral development banks community. So this is part of the reason why we support project preparation.
Thank you, Andrew. Delfina, you had a question about the challenges financing NBS in LATAM. Could you ask that question, please?
Yes, I actually had many questions because I am from Latin America, so I was motivated to ask too much. But yes, one of them was, first, if there were successful cases of NBS financing in Latin America, and some cases were already presented by Jan Leo. But then, yes, what are the main challenges? I mean, there are challenges in financing NBS. Now, what are critical to Latin America, and to what extent this NBS agenda has drilled down into the government's the local government, the national, at least, governments in Latin America. And I had one follow-up question on that. Yes, now, and what are silver lines in that sense?
Ciao, Delfina. Well, the silver line, let's start from the silver line, is that we have examples. Let's say there was a concept that until a few years ago was arcane, limited to satellite interventions, and now we have at least a logic model that all this intervention together. And the paper will have a few of these examples, but like in the case of Quito, the funds are not new, and they are becoming more streamlined way of managing the issues, and again securing long-term results. Also seeing on the bonds, I mean, that the example of the Dutch green bond will be replicated also in Latin America. We have worked with a few countries on issuing their sovereign bonds, and we are including MBS in their taxonomies. So when we look for projects and expenditures, we will look for those. The main issue is still a kind of awareness. What constitutes MBS? The taxonomies and principles are well defined. Policy, let's say, international dialogue. When drilling down locally, the knowledge and awareness of those is still not great, and the data is not great. I think there are broad estimates about how much biodiversity risk we have in Latin America, what's the economic value, what is the natural capital stock at risk in Latin America. Less is known about what's the value of these stocks. Let's say in the case of the Quintana Roo example, the mission of the coral reef took significant effort supported by philanthropists at the beginning. Effort that probably the state of Quintana Roo could not have faced alone. So these are the initial bottlenecks, and without those numbers about the value of the coral reef, the relations between wind speed and damages, it would have been impossible to write a parametric insurance contract that would have made sense and would have, let's say, be providing the necessary funds at an affordable cost for the state. So that's probably, to me, that's the main issue we are still working on.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next session, which is open questions for both or all three, sorry, of the presenters. And Virginie, this is your chance maybe to ask your question of one of the presenters on something they said that maybe elicited some sort of thoughts that you would like some clarification on. So if you could fire your question, and you have a choice of either Gianleo or Ancor, or they can decide who answers your question.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to choose one. I mean, you said initially that there's a reduction of infrastructure investment from governments. And I was wondering how it translates in your own operations. Do you have a decrease in the lending as well, which, or in the support you're providing, because you have a decrease of the number of projects? I'm just wondering if trying to think about the snowball effects of the consequences of the pandemic, and maybe trying to find new sources of pipelines or projects pipelines beyond governance. So it's a bit higher level. And I was actually thinking, what do you need to redefine a bit your role as an MDB in a context of reduced government activity and voila.
Well, I don't know. I can jump in, Gianleo, if you want.
Definitely for you, this question.
Okay. Just in case. I mean, it's a very interesting question that can take a lot of time to answer and to redefine roles and so on. But I'm gonna. But for most of the audience that do not know what an institution such as the IDB does when it comes to infrastructure, we have different windows. No, we have the public windows working directly with governments in order to fund projects that has that sovereign guarantee. Then we have a private window, which is called IDB Invest, and has a different scenario working with the private sector. And then we, as a PPP unit that work as an advisory service department, I would say, in order to reinforce the capabilities of countries to prepare projects and to help them to prepare and structure PPP projects. Just that to put all the audience on the same page. Of course, we from the public side, we are part of the infrastructure investment arena in the region, and we suffer equally in the same proportion that affects to the role that we NDVs play in Latin America. I would say that all the NDVs together that work in the region accounts for between 7 to 10% of infrastructure investment in the region. So I would say that we suffer proportionately this crisis. But when it comes to PPPs, and I think I was listening to your question and thinking about that, one of the things that it's important to us to understand and to explain is that many governments on some institutions can start thinking on PPPs as a solution just because we don't have the public resources to come up with some projects and to keep working on some of them. And this is the wrong reason to go for a PPP. Of course, we are in a situation where there's a lot of deficit that we need to come up with solutions in order to fund infrastructure. But we cannot go with bad projects just as a PPP just because we don't have any other source to go on with those. So basically, one of the main challenges that we face now is that we as institution, and I guess like from OECD is the same situation here, is that maybe much more now than ever, we need to put particularly attention to the importance of developing good projects, no matter if they're going to be PPPs or they are going to be traditional public procurement projects. This is an issue that affects to all of the procurement modalities that we can implement in order to develop infrastructure. And we see that when we do every diagnosis that we do when it comes to, for example, what I mentioned on cost overruns, time delays, renegotiations, the impact on contingent liabilities. This is something that is related to the nature of infrastructure, not to the procurement modality. So one important message that we need to pass, I guess, from our institutions these days is that we need to put particularly attention to the fact that the projects that are proposed and planned and prioritized and prepared are good projects, that when they deliver good value for money, they're going to deliver as a PPPs. That kind of sequence from planning prioritization, it's key, and it's I would say, one of the key messages or issues that we need to highlight these days in order to be able to defend that the good projects are done, and those good projects that can be good PPPs are done as a PPP. That's kind of a priority to us, I would say.
Thank you very much. Gianleo, I'm going to give you the chance to ask Virginie a question because Ancor has been busy for the last few minutes. So do you have a question that you'd like to ask her?
So I think it's don't want to take the time from the attendance of the no, I mean the question is on I had my notes. When we say in practice, say, what are the main variables and main dimensions a policymaker, especially when thinking about like an infrastructure plan, with in consideration? Because it's as we've seen it with the toolbox, many times even the concept of resiliency is so level that when you translate it into practice, it means a lot of different things that you have to do. So what does strategic foresight means, and how you see it implemented?
Thank you.
So your question is, what does strategic foresight mean, and why is it useful, right?
Yes.
That's a very good question. I had to give this answer many times, actually. I wondered myself at the beginning, but I've been surprised. The value of those exercises is really to bring in a room people from different background and perspectives. And so the value, as I said, is in the process. Basically, you bring infrastructure engineers, local governments, representatives from ministries of finance, of economy, person from Google, from new technologies. I mean, a group of people where each of them is coming with its own set of beliefs and perspective, and the value of the exercise is to bring in the room all the kind of emerging ideas that could be radically different, that create a radically different future. So it's about identifying those, how do they call that in foresight? It's not blind spot, but those very low message, low signals that will have a huge influence in the future. And what is useful is it gives people an idea of what they need to follow, what they need to be interested in, what in the future could impact the future demand in infrastructure, the future demand for transport, the future demand for energy, and what could be the emerging technologies that could radically disrupt the way they are thinking about their infrastructure systems. So it's really bringing in the room the latest thinking, the latest technology, but also the legacy of the practitioners, of the investors on the ground, and try to get them with develop a common vision of what different futures could look like. And then you think about an infrastructure project and an infrastructure strategy, and you stress test it. I mean, I'm planning to build, I don't know, an additional peripheric around Paris. May make sense now. Is it really going to make sense in 20 years? Of course, those scenario planning, I mean, one of the scenarios could have been there's a pandemic, so there's teleworking. So does it really make sense? Isn't there a better way to provide it? It's not a, again, the value is in the process. It's not the result that is real, but it's more the creation of a community of people that are influencing actually what means good infrastructure and fit for purpose infrastructure in the future. Voilà, we may organize a few foresight workshops, so I'll make sure you have an invitation.
Thank you very much. Brendan Gilmore has been very patient. He asked his question almost an hour ago and I haven't had a chance to get him. Brendan, could you ask your question? Make sure that your screen is on, please.
Brendan is no longer here.
Okay, then I'm going to go down to Dan Lamy. I see your hand is up. You have a question about directing nature-based solutions to brownfields. Could you ask your question and please activate your screen as well, please?
Yes. Hello. Sorry, David. I know I have two screens running here. That's why you saw two names. Sorry about that. It's just a coordination issue with the screen. Yeah. So I guess my question, well, it was two-folded, but you kind of made me rush one. So on one end, I was wondering the experience of maybe directing nature-based solutions to sort of rehabilitation, renewal of existing assets that maybe need some sort of refurbishing and wrapping those around. I see it as taking care of some of the project development issues that you would get with a greenfield solution in terms of even the procurement, the bidding and things like that. With an asset that's already operational, you just want to sort of retrofit or sort of improve that asset. And if I may just throw in the second one, and this is also for Virginie here because she had a very interesting presentation at the beginning. You know, in Europe, they pay for infrastructure in euros. In the US dollars. I think Inter-American Bank would have similar challenges that we have, that only ports, seaports and airports are assets that actually probably bring in Forex. Every other thing you borrow in dollars and it now gets into local economy. So when you say innovative, I was curious to see if there are issues that OECD has thought about in terms of how do you really because it's a real cost to sort of developing countries in our region, you know, in terms, and that erodes any of the benefits of the $1 to $4 in the future, because with high interest rates and high premium payments and everything, that all goes. So I think a lot of these estimates are made using euros in Europe and USD elsewhere. So just practically. So thank you very much, David. I hope you all heard me.
Virginie, you're on mute.
Yes,
Oh.
sorry. Okay, I thought there were two questions, one for the others and one for me. I don't have the answer to your question. No currency risk is a huge risk in the infrastructure sphere, but as I've never been really involved in project investment, I know there are tools to mitigate this risk, but I couldn't help you on the technicalities and the details of those tools. I can have a look at the OECD if some of my colleagues in the Directorate of Finance are saying something about it, but maybe my colleagues from IDB will have a better view on those things as infrastructure investors and practitioners.
Thank you. So we'll look for feedback. We are out of time. I just want to thank you, Virginie, for telling us one thing I found very interesting is the role that the OECD plays, and that you are a source of tools and information that can be used, especially, and it's pity we didn't have more time to get into it, but which is critically important, is the whole idea of governance. I think that's critically important. Thank you also to Giovanni and Ancor from the IDB. Your tools, especially the ones that Giovanni, I apologize for cutting you off right at the end, the 5 or 6 tools, I think those are very, very useful and are very helpful. And one thing that I'm really excited about, and Virginie, I hope you'll invite me to it as well, is the whole idea of your strategic foresight workshops in the community. I think that that is critically important, that, you know, we have these conversations across communities and involve all bodies, because this is, you know, we can't operate in silos and we can't operate in isolation from one another. So thank you very, very much for all of the comments, the feedback. It was, you know, I learned a lot myself, and I'm going to hand over to Danilo to do the closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And of course, thank you, Virginie, Ancor, and Jaleo for two very interesting presentations, and everyone for the questions. The chat was very active, and I know that we have not been able to answer all the questions, but I just saw that Jaleo actually sent a message with some references there. If you have Jaleo, Ancor, and Virginie, anything you would like to share with the group, you can also send to me, and I can send to everyone on the list. And for everyone in the group as well, if you have any questions specifically to Ancor, Jaleo, and Virginie, please feel free to send them to me, and I can make the connection so you can also be in touch as practitioners working on the field. So without